My parents chose my brother's kids over mine, so I made them regret it in the best way possible, and then I never thought I would see the day when my own parents looked me in the eye and told me my children were not welcome in their home. Yet there I was, standing in the middle of my kitchen, gripping my phone so tightly my knuckles turned white as my mother's voice rang in my ears. Thanksgiving was just a few weeks away, and for all the tension that had built up between us over the years, I still held on to some ridiculous hope that we could set it all aside for one evening and just be a family. My kids, Aaron and Lily, adored their grandparents despite the distance that had formed, and no matter how many times I had tried to ignore the favoritism, no matter how often I convinced myself that I was overreacting, I could never fully shake the feeling that something was always off. When my mother called, her voice was unusually light, the kind of tone she only used when she was about to say something she knew I wouldn't like, but wanted to present as if it was completely normal. There was no small talk, no warm greeting, just a simple and direct statement that immediately put me on edge. "We need to talk about Thanksgiving this year," she said, and for a brief moment, I let myself believe that maybe, just maybe, this was going to be one of those rare times when my parents made an effort to bring the family together without making me feel like an afterthought. I didn't even hesitate before responding, already picturing the way their house would be filled with the scent of roasted turkey, the subtle hint of cinnamon from my mother's apple pie, and the warmth of a full family gathering. "Of course, what's the plan?" I asked, my guard lowering just a little, but then came the pause, just long enough to send a cold, uneasy feeling creeping up my spine. "Well," she said, clearing her throat, the brightness in her voice faltering slightly, "this year we're doing things a little differently. It's going to be a much smaller dinner, just adults, something more intimate." The words landed like a slap, but for some stupid reason, I still clung to the possibility that maybe she meant everyone. Maybe they had just decided to have a quiet dinner without any of the grandkids. "Oh," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "So no kids at all?" There was another pause, just a little too long to be innocent, and then, more hesitantly this time, she finally said the thing that would shatter any last illusion I had been holding on to. "Well, no, not exactly." I felt my stomach twist into a cold knot as I braced myself for whatever was coming next, because I already knew, deep down, that I wasn't going to like it. "What do you mean?" I asked, forcing my voice to stay calm even as my pulse pounded in my ears. She let out a sigh, the kind that made it sound like she was the one being put in an uncomfortable position, like she was the one being forced to have a difficult conversation. "We love your kids," she said, her voice soft, like she was trying to keep me from getting upset. "We really do, but they're just, energetic, and honestly, we just feel like it would be better if you left them with a sitter this year." For a moment, I just stood there, gripping the edge of the counter, feeling like the floor had just dropped out from beneath me. I had expected favoritism. I had expected some passive-aggressive comment about my parenting, but I had never expected them to actually come out and say it so bluntly, that my children weren't wanted at the table. "So just my kids?" I asked, my voice tighter than I intended it to be. "What about Daniel's?" Daniel, my older brother, the golden child, the one who could do no wrong in our parents' eyes even when he did. She hesitated, and that was all the answer I needed, but I still waited for her to say it out loud. "Daniel and Sophie are coming with their boys," she admitted finally, as if she hadn't just shoved a knife between my ribs and twisted it. "But you know how well-behaved they are, how much quieter, how much more refined. It's just easier to have them at the table." A wave of heat flushed through me so fast I thought I might actually get sick, because there it was, the thing I had been trying to ignore for years, finally spoken aloud with no shame, no hesitation, no attempt to even pretend that she didn't mean exactly what she had said. "They're just children," I said, my voice shaking slightly as I fought to keep my temper in check. "Aaron is 10 and Lily is 6. Of course they have energy, but they're sweet and they love you." "We're just trying to have a peaceful evening," she replied, her tone clipped now, irritated that I wasn't just accepting this the way I was supposed to. "It's not personal." I clenched my jaw so hard it hurt, swallowing back all the sharp words that were fighting to spill out, because I knew if I let them out now, there would be no taking them back. But it wasn't just about Thanksgiving. It was every little thing, every moment that had built up over the years, the way they had always treated my kids like an afterthought, while putting Daniel's on a pedestal, the way they had shown up for his son's school plays, but never once came to Aaron's soccer games, the way Christmas gifts were always just a little more thoughtful, a little more expensive, a little more special for Daniel's boys. And now they weren't even bothering to hide it anymore. "I can't believe this," I whispered, shaking my head, barely able to process what I was hearing. "You're actually telling me that my kids aren't welcome, but Daniel's are?" "Oh, don't be dramatic," she sighed, like I was overreacting, like I was making a big deal out of nothing. "It's just one dinner. You and Liam are still invited, of course." I almost laughed at the absurdity of it all. They wanted me there. They wanted my presence, but not the two people I loved most in the world. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to breathe, forcing myself to stay in control. "No," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "If my kids aren't welcome, then neither am I." There was a long silence, so long that I thought maybe she had hung up, but then finally, she exhaled sharply, the way she always did when she thought I was being unreasonable. "Suit yourself," she said. And then, just like that, she hung up. I stood there, staring at my phone, my breath unsteady, my whole body tense with anger. But in the next room, I could still hear my kids giggling as they built a pillow fort, completely oblivious to the fact that their grandparents, the ones they adored, the ones they talked about with so much excitement, had just cast them aside like an inconvenience. I took a deep breath, my mind racing, my pulse still hammering in my ears. I had spent my whole life trying to please my parents, trying to earn their approval, but at what cost? If I let them get away with this, if I went to that dinner while my children sat at home wondering why they weren't good enough, what kind of father would that make me? No, I wasn't doing this anymore. They had made their choice, and now it was time for me to make mine. And they were going to regret it sooner than they thought. I sat at the kitchen table long after the call had ended, staring at my phone like it might somehow erase the conversation that had just taken place. But no matter how many times I replayed it in my head, the words remained exactly the same. My mother had looked at my children, the two little humans I had spent every waking moment loving, protecting, and raising with everything I had, and decided that they weren't worth a seat at the table. It wasn't even a moment of hesitation, a slip of the tongue, a misunderstanding that could be smoothed over with a little patience and conversation. It was deliberate, intentional, spoken with a kind of confidence that made it painfully clear this wasn't something she had just come up with on the spot. She had thought about this, planned it out, weighed her options, and in the end, she had still chosen to exclude them. I clenched my fists against the wooden surface of the table, my pulse pounding in my ears as a fresh wave of anger rolled through me, hotter and heavier than the last. For years, I had tried to convince myself that my parents' favoritism toward Daniel and his children wasn't as bad as it seemed, that I was just being sensitive, that maybe I was reading too much into things that didn't actually mean anything. Every time they showed up for his son's baseball games, but forgot to call when Aaron won his science fair, I told myself they had just been busy. Every time Christmas morning came and went with my kids unwrapping generic sweaters while Daniel's kids got expensive gaming consoles, I reminded myself that maybe they just didn't realize the difference. Every time they called me last minute to run errands for them, but couldn't be bothered to remember Lily's birthday, I swallowed the bitterness and forced myself to believe that deep down, despite everything, they still loved all of us the same. But they didn't. I could see it now, more clearly than ever before, and it hit me like a sledgehammer to the ribs, knocking the air straight from my lungs. It had never been in my head, never been some exaggerated insecurity I had let fester over the years. They had always chosen Daniel, always placed him and his family above me and mine, always treated my kids like second-class citizens while making his feel like royalty. The only difference was that now they weren't even bothering to pretend otherwise. I reached for my phone before I could think better of it, my fingers trembling slightly as I scrolled through my contacts until I landed on Daniel's name. If there was even the slightest chance that he had any idea this was happening, that he had heard about this ridiculous Thanksgiving arrangement and said nothing, then I needed to hear it from him directly. The phone rang 3 times before he picked up, his voice light and casual, like he wasn't expecting anything out of the ordinary. "Hey man, what's up?" I didn't bother with pleasantries, didn't waste time pretending this was just a normal conversation between brothers catching up on their lives. "Did you know about Thanksgiving?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended, but I didn't care. A brief pause, just long enough to tell me everything I needed to know before he even opened his mouth. "Mom mentioned something about it," he admitted, his tone shifting just slightly, like he was already preparing to defend himself before I could even say another word. "She just wants a calm dinner this year. Nothing too crazy. You know how she is." My grip on the phone tightened so hard my knuckles ached. "A calm dinner," I repeated, the words tasting bitter on my tongue. "And my kids don't fit into that." He sighed like I was the one making a big deal out of nothing, like I was blowing this entire thing out of proportion when all they were trying to do was enjoy a peaceful holiday. "Look, I get that you're upset, but you know how Aaron and Lily can be," he said, his voice carrying that same condescending edge it always had when he was explaining something he thought I was too stupid to understand. "They've got a lot of energy, and Mom and Dad just wanted something a little quieter this year. It's not personal." I could actually feel my blood pressure spike, feel the heat crawl up the back of my neck as I struggled to keep my anger from boiling over into something that would turn this into an all-out screaming match. "Not personal," I said, shaking my head in disbelief. "They're your niece and nephew, Daniel, and Mom just told me that they aren't welcome at Thanksgiving while your kids get to sit at the table like nothing's wrong." "How the hell is that not personal?" "They didn't say they weren't welcome," he argued, the irritation in his voice growing more obvious now, like he was running out of patience for this entire conversation. "They just suggested that maybe you leave them with a sitter, that's all." The casualness of his words, the complete lack of remorse, or even the slightest attempt to acknowledge how absolutely insane this entire situation was, made something inside me snap. "Would you have agreed if they asked you to leave your kids with a sitter?" I shot back, my voice colder now, sharper, cutting straight through the bullshit he was trying to feed me. Another pause, shorter this time, but just long enough for me to know that the answer was exactly what I thought it would be. "That's different," he said finally, and that was all I needed to hear. I let out a humorless laugh, shaking my head as I pinched the bridge of my nose in frustration, trying to force myself to stay calm when all I really wanted to do was drive to his house and throw my phone straight at his smug, indifferent face. "Of course it is," I muttered, more to myself than to him. He exhaled heavily, like I was exhausting him just by refusing to roll over and accept what was happening without a fight. "Man, you always do this," he said, his tone shifting into something almost patronizing now, like he was speaking to a child instead of his own brother. "You take everything so personally and make it bigger than it needs to be. It's one dinner, that's it. Why are you making this into some massive thing?" I pressed my fingers against my temple, forcing myself to breathe through the overwhelming frustration clawing its way up my throat. "Because it's not just one dinner," I said, my voice steady even though everything inside me was anything but. "It's every time they put you and your family first while treating me and my kids like we're something they have to deal with instead of people they actually love." He was silent for a long moment, and I could hear the barely restrained sigh he was holding back, could already tell that whatever came out of his mouth next was going to be the exact thing that made me decide, once and for all, that I was done trying to fix any of this. "Look," he said finally, his voice slower now, more calculated. "Maybe we can work something out. If you're struggling financially, and that's what this is really about, maybe you don't have to cut them off completely. Just send them a little every month, keep things civil, and then everyone wins." And that was it. That was the moment I knew, without a doubt, that they had never seen me as family, never seen me as someone they actually valued or loved. I was just a resource, just a tool, just a means to make their lives easier while giving them absolutely nothing in return. I sat in silence after hanging up on Daniel, my phone still clutched in my hand, the weight of the conversation pressing down on me like a boulder I could no longer hold up. For years, I had ignored the signs, made excuses, convinced myself that I was imagining things, but there was no room left for doubt anymore. My parents didn't see me as their son, not in any way that actually mattered, and they sure as hell didn't see my kids as their grandchildren. They wanted control, they wanted compliance, they wanted to keep me in my place, ensuring that I remained the reliable, convenient option whenever they needed something. But they didn't want me as an equal. And they didn't want my kids at all. I thought back to every moment that should have told me this was inevitable. The birthdays they forgot, but somehow always remembered for Daniel's kids. The way they had never once offered to take Aaron or Lily for an afternoon, but had no problem watching Daniel's boys for entire weekends. The way my father had never really looked me in the eye when he praised my brother's career, but barely acknowledged mine existed. And yet, somehow, even with all of that, I had still believed that one day they would change, one day they would see me, one day they would love my kids the way they were supposed to. But that day wasn't coming, and it never would. I didn't cry, didn't feel any sadness, didn't feel any lingering hope that things could be repaired. I just felt something inside me snap, something I had been holding together with nothing but sheer force of will for longer than I could even remember. And once it was gone, there was no getting it back. The next morning, I woke up to a text from my mother, the first she had sent since hanging up on me 2 days ago, and I already knew before I even read it that it wasn't going to be an apology. Nathan, I really hope you've taken some time to calm down because this entire thing has gotten completely out of hand. Thanksgiving isn't about playing favorites or excluding anyone. We're just trying to have a peaceful evening without any unnecessary chaos. You and Liam are still welcome, but if you're going to keep acting like this, maybe you should think about what kind of example you're setting for your children. I read the message twice, slowly, letting every single word sink in, and by the time I reached the end, I realized that I wasn't even angry anymore. I was just done. I set my phone down, exhaled slowly, and walked into the living room where Aaron and Lily were sprawled across the floor, coloring in a giant sketch pad they had been obsessing over for the past week. Lily's hair was a complete mess, her curls tangled from the way she had been rolling around on the carpet, and Aaron was humming some made-up tune under his breath, completely lost in whatever world he was creating with his colored pencils. They looked up when they saw me, grinning in that way that only kids could, and in that moment, everything became crystal clear. They were all that mattered. I wasn't going to spend one more second chasing after people who didn't want us, and I sure as hell wasn't going to let them dictate the kind of life my kids were going to have. They didn't want my children at Thanksgiving? Fine. They didn't want them as part of their family? Fine. They didn't deserve them, and they never would. For the first time in my life, I stopped waiting for my parents to change and decided that I wasn't going to let them take up space in my life any longer. The days leading up to Thanksgiving were quiet, almost unsettlingly so, as if my parents had taken my silence as some kind of temporary rebellion that would inevitably pass once I realized how unreasonable I was being. I ignored every text, every call, every half-hearted attempt to guilt me back into compliance. And with every day that passed, I felt lighter. When my father called me 2 nights before the holiday, his tone brisk and impatient as he left a voicemail demanding that I stop this nonsense and act like a mature adult, I deleted it without a second thought. When Daniel sent me a message dripping with passive-aggressive disappointment about how family is supposed to stick together, not tear itself apart over a single dinner, I didn't even bother to respond. For the first time, I wasn't the one trying to fix things. On Thanksgiving morning, I woke up feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time, completely at peace. There was no stress, no anxiety, no lingering resentment simmering beneath the surface. There was just my family, my real family, the only people who actually mattered. Aaron and Lily were already up, their excitement contagious as they ran into the kitchen, chattering a mile a minute about the breakfast we had planned. Liam was standing at the stove, his sleeves rolled up as he poured batter onto the griddle, a smirk already forming on his face as he glanced over at me. "I give it 10 minutes before they're covered in flour from head to toe," he said, tilting his head toward the kids, who were practically vibrating with anticipation as they waited for their turn to help. I leaned against the counter, watching as Lily grabbed the whisk with both hands, her entire body shaking as she mixed the batter with far more enthusiasm than was necessary. And Aaron carefully measured out sugar like he was handling a high-stakes science experiment. 5 minutes, tops, I said, shaking my head as Lily flung a little too much flour onto the counter. For the next hour, we cooked, laughed, made an absolute mess of the kitchen, and for the first time in years, I didn't spend Thanksgiving morning checking the time, dreading a family gathering that would leave me feeling like an outsider in my own bloodline. There was no expectation to play along with the charade, no need to force a smile through the tightness in my chest, no pretending that everything was fine when it never had been. Then, right in the middle of flipping the last batch of pancakes, my phone rang. I glanced at the screen, already knowing who it was before I even looked. My mother's name flashed across the screen, and for a moment, I considered letting it go to voicemail like I had every other call that week. But something in me shifted. I wasn't angry anymore, wasn't looking for an argument, wasn't waiting for an apology that was never going to come. I was just ready to be done. I swiped to answer, keeping my voice neutral as I said, "What do you want?" There was a beat of silence, just long enough to tell me that she hadn't expected me to actually pick up. "Oh, so now you answer," she said, her tone already dripping with irritation. "I suppose you're just sitting at home feeling sorry for yourself while the rest of us are here enjoying a lovely dinner." I exhaled slowly, forcing myself to remain calm, because at this point, I wasn't even surprised. "If you called to gloat, I really don't have time for this." She scoffed, the sound sharp and dismissive. "That's not why I called," she said, her voice taking on that familiar sharpness she always used when she was about to demand something from me. "I need to ask you something important." I pinched the bridge of my nose, already exhausted before she even got to the point. "What now?" There was a pause, then, in a tone so matter-of-fact that it almost knocked the breath out of me, she said, "Did you cancel the credit card?" For a few seconds, I just stood there, gripping the phone so tightly my fingers ached, trying to process the sheer audacity of what I had just heard. My mother, the same woman who had so easily dismissed my children as unworthy of sitting at her Thanksgiving table, was now calling me, not to apologize, not to mend the gaping wound she had ripped open, not to acknowledge that she had been cruel, but to ask about a canceled credit card that, until this very moment, I hadn't even realized she was still using. I turned away from the kitchen, away from Liam and the kids, lowering my voice as I forced myself to speak in a tone that didn't immediately reveal the fury clawing its way up my throat. "What are you talking about?" I asked, even though I already had a sinking feeling that I knew exactly where this was going. There was an exaggerated sigh on the other end of the line, like she was the one being inconvenienced, like I was the one creating a problem out of nothing. "Your father's credit card," she said, as if that was supposed to clarify everything, as if I had been given the details beforehand and should have immediately understood what she meant. "The one we've been using for groceries, gas, and other essential things. It was declined this morning when I tried to pay at the store." A slow, ice-cold realization settled over me, making my stomach tighten with something that felt dangerously close to rage. I had added them as authorized users on one of my accounts years ago, back when my father had been recovering from surgery and money had been tight, back when I had still been operating under the naive assumption that my parents loved and appreciated me in the same way they did Daniel. It had been meant as a temporary arrangement, just something to help them get through a rough financial period, something I had fully intended to remove once they were back on their feet. But life had gotten busy, things had gotten in the way, and I had completely forgotten about it, until now. Until my mother, the same woman who had just days ago told me that my children weren't welcome at her dinner table because they weren't as refined as Daniel's kids, was standing in a checkout line somewhere, trying to run up another bill on my account, and only now realizing that the well had finally run dry. I let out a slow, measured breath, willing myself to stay calm even as my pulse thundered in my ears. "You mean my credit card," I said, my voice even but dangerously sharp, leaving no room for misinterpretation. There was a beat of silence, just long enough for me to imagine the way her face must have twisted in irritation at the correction. "Oh, don't be so dramatic," she scoffed, her tone dismissive in that way it always was when she was trying to brush past something she didn't want to acknowledge. "It's just a card, and you make good money. We figured it wasn't a big deal." I clenched my jaw so hard I could feel the pressure radiating up into my temples, my other hand curling into a fist against my side. "You figured what?" I asked, my voice dropping into something dangerously low, something I hadn't even realized I was capable of until this exact moment. "That you could just keep using my money indefinitely without ever mentioning it, without ever asking, without ever once considering that maybe, just maybe, I would eventually notice?" She let out another sigh, this one heavier, more performative, like I was the one being unreasonable, like she was the victim here instead of the person who had been stealing from her own son for years. "Oh, don't act like this is some big betrayal," she said, her voice taking on that exasperated edge that had always made me feel like I was the problem whenever I confronted her about anything. "We raised you. We gave you everything, and the least you could do is support us now that we're older." A hollow, bitter laugh escaped before I could stop it, because of course that was how she saw this. Not as theft, not as an obvious breach of trust, not as an undeniable example of just how little she actually valued me as a person, but as something I owed them. In her mind, this wasn't just about money. It was about control, about ensuring that no matter how much I tried to separate myself, no matter how many times I tried to assert my own independence, I would always remain under their thumb. I inhaled sharply, forcing my voice to remain level even though every fiber of my being wanted to start shouting. "So let me get this straight," I said, my grip tightening around the phone as I paced toward the front door, needing to put some distance between myself and my family before they saw just how much this was getting to me. "You and Dad told me that my kids weren't good enough to sit at your table, that they weren't the kind of children you wanted to celebrate with, but you still expected me to keep paying for your groceries like nothing happened?" There was another pause, just long enough for me to know that she knew how bad this sounded, that she was trying to come up with a way to spin this in her favor before she responded. "Oh, for God's sake, Nathan, don't be so sensitive," she said, her tone sharper now, more annoyed that I wasn't just rolling over and accepting this like I always had. "It's just one dinner, and you're acting like we've disowned you entirely." I ran a hand over my face, exhaling slowly through my nose, trying to keep myself from losing whatever patience I had left. "It's not just one dinner," I said, my voice eerily calm now, so controlled that even I barely recognized it. "It's every time you've treated Daniel like he was worth more than me. It's every time you've made it clear that his kids are real family, while mine are just an afterthought. It's every time I've swallowed my pride, made excuses, let it slide, and told myself that maybe, just maybe, one day you'd actually see me and my kids as equal. And now, after all of that, after everything you've done, you seriously think I'm going to keep handing you money like nothing happened?" She let out a sharp, dramatic breath, the kind she always used when she was about to deliver some final, cutting remark meant to make me feel guilty. "You know what, Nathan?" she said, her voice suddenly cold, her words clipped and final. "This is exactly why we don't like having difficult conversations with you. You always overreact, and you always turn yourself into the victim." I exhaled through my nose, tilting my head back against the wall, and when I spoke again, my voice was dangerously calm, devoid of any remaining emotion. "You're right about one thing," I said, my grip on the phone relaxing as I finally let it all go. "I did cancel the card. And since we're having honest conversations now, let me make something very clear. You will never see another cent from me for as long as you live." There was a sharp inhale on the other end, a startled silence so deafening that I could almost picture the way she had gone stiff, her entire body rigid with shock at the reality of what I had just said. "Nathan," she started, but I cut her off before she could launch into whatever manipulative speech she had already prepared. "And while we're at it," I continued, my voice still calm, but carrying a finality that left no room for argument, "don't expect Christmas gifts, birthday gifts, or anything else from me, ever again. You made your choice when you decided that my kids weren't good enough for you, and now I'm making mine." There was a long, heavy silence, thick with tension, and then, in a voice colder than I had ever heard from her before, she finally said, "You'll regret this." I smiled, shaking my head as I reached for the doorknob and pulled the front door open, letting the cool air hit my face. "No, Mom," I said, stepping outside and taking in my first deep breath of real, absolute freedom. "I really don't think I will." The silence didn't last long, because people like my parents never let things go when they finally lose control over someone they once had under their thumb. The first few days after that call were quiet, almost peaceful, and for the first time in years, I didn't wake up with the weight of obligation pressing down on my chest like a boulder I had been carrying since childhood. I knew they would never apologize, never admit they had been wrong, never acknowledge that they had crossed a line that could never be repaired, but I still wasn't prepared for how quickly their desperation would escalate. 2 days before Christmas, while I was out buying last-minute gifts for Aaron and Lily, my phone buzzed in my pocket with a message from Daniel, the first one I had received since our last conversation. I didn't even have to open it to know exactly what it was going to say, because if there was one thing my brother had mastered, it was inserting himself into situations that had nothing to do with him while pretending he was some neutral party trying to keep the family together. Against my better judgment, I swiped to read it, already bracing myself for whatever condescending nonsense was waiting for me. "You really need to stop this before it gets even worse. Mom and Dad are devastated, and you're being stubborn over something that should have never been a big deal in the first place. Just apologize, come to Christmas dinner, and we can all move on like adults instead of dragging this out for no reason." I stared at the message for a long time, shaking my head at the absolute audacity of it, because of course he had managed to twist everything into something that was my fault. I could almost hear his voice, that same patronizing tone he had used my entire life, as if I was some wayward child throwing a tantrum instead of a grown man who had finally decided he wasn't going to keep setting himself on fire just to keep other people warm. I typed out a response, my fingers moving fast, my patience completely gone. Funny how they weren't devastated when they told me my kids weren't good enough to sit at their table. Funny how they weren't devastated when they spent years treating you and your family like royalty while treating mine like we were barely worth remembering. Funny how they weren't devastated when they stole from me for years and never once thought to tell me about it. But now that I've cut them off, now they're devastated? Yeah, I think they'll survive. I hit send and blocked his number before he even had the chance to respond. On Christmas Eve, while Aaron and Lily were running through the living room in their pajamas, barely able to contain their excitement about the presents they had already started trying to sneak peeks at under the tree, the doorbell rang, loud and insistent. I didn't even have to look to know who it was, but when I checked the peephole anyway, I wasn't even remotely surprised to see my parents standing on the porch, bundled up against the cold, holding a massive gift-wrapped box between them like some kind of peace offering wrapped in expensive paper. I exhaled slowly, weighing my options, knowing that ignoring them wouldn't stop them from standing there as long as it took for me to acknowledge their presence. I opened the door just enough to make it clear that this wasn't an invitation for them to step inside. My mother's face lit up with forced cheerfulness, her tone dripping with artificial warmth that barely covered the sharp edges of her true intentions. "Merry Christmas, sweetheart," she said, as if the last conversation we had never happened, as if she hadn't spent weeks making it clear that my children didn't matter to her at all. My father held the gift out toward me, his expression neutral but expectant, like he was waiting for me to accept it so we could all pretend none of this had ever happened. I didn't even look at it, didn't let myself waver, didn't let myself get pulled back into their world of guilt and manipulation and obligation disguised as love. "No thanks," I said, my voice calm but firm, my grip tightening on the edge of the door. My mother's smile faltered, her fingers clutching the edges of her coat a little tighter as she glanced at my father before turning back to me. "Don't be stubborn," she said, her voice taking on that clipped tone I had heard my entire life whenever I wasn't falling in line exactly the way she wanted. "Let's not ruin Christmas over a misunderstanding." I let out a short, humorless laugh, shaking my head at the sheer absurdity of it all. You already ruined Christmas, I said, my voice lower now, sharper, cutting through whatever delusion she had convinced herself of. You ruined it when you told me my children weren't good enough for you. But now that you've lost control, now that you've lost access to my money, now that you've realized I'm done, suddenly I'm supposed to just pretend everything is fine? No, I don't think so. My father sighed, rubbing a hand over his face like I was exhausting him just by standing my ground. Come on, Nathan, he said, his tone carrying that same exasperation I had heard so many times before. Let's just be a family again. I studied him for a long moment, really looked at him, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't searching for something that had never been there. You don't want to be a family, I said, shaking my head, my voice quieter now, but no less resolute. You want me to go back to being useful? Their silence told me everything I needed to know. I stepped back just slightly, my hand tightening on the door as I stared them down. Take your gift and go, I said, my voice final, my patience completely gone. My mother's expression hardened, her mask slipping just enough to reveal the simmering anger underneath. Nathan, don't be selfish, she snapped, her voice sharp with frustration. Think about the children. I smiled then, cold and knowing, because she had finally said the one thing that had sealed this entire decision for me from the very beginning. I am thinking about the children, I said, my voice calm, steady, absolute. That's exactly why you're not in their lives anymore. My father's jaw tightened, his lips pressing together in a thin line, his entire body radiating barely restrained irritation. You really want to do this? He asked, his tone lower now, almost threatening. I exhaled slowly, my grip steady as I pulled the door closed inch by inch. I already did, I said, and then, without another word, I shut the door in their faces. That night, as Aaron and Lily tore through their presents, their laughter filling every corner of the house, I felt something settle deep in my chest, something I hadn't felt in years, peace. For the first time, Christmas wasn't about proving anything, wasn't about earning love that was never real, wasn't about making myself smaller just to fit into a place I had never belonged. It was just us, just the people who actually mattered, just real family. And for the first time in my life, I realized that I had already won.